Hi, I'm Stephanie from Museums.love, and today from the home office we're going to be looking at one of the most famous sculptures in Berlin, the bust of Nefertiti. This is an ancient Egyptian sculpture that came to Berlin through circumstances we're going to look at in this video. We'll take a look at the ancient history of the object, the modern history of the object, including the rediscovery, and why it's still so important for us today. So who was Nefertiti? She was the queen of one of the famous pharaohs of ancient Egypt, Akhenaten. He's so famous because he decided that all of the other Egyptian gods should not be worshipped anymore, except for the sun disk, the Aten, and this was the first monotheistic religion that we see in Egypt. Now, Nefertiti was just the queen, but she was one of the tools of Akhenaten's rule in that while they were the royal couple together from about the 1350s to the 1330s BC, she appears in a lot of art next to him as one of his campaign poster girls for what his rule was all about. Nefertiti appears in a lot of art alongside Akhenaten and sometimes their daughters, the princesses. But these are not casual pictures of the royal couple. They have a certain point to make. This is the official message of Akhenaten's rule. The Aten, or the sun disk, is the only god and he is responsible for all life. So the symbol of the Ankh for life is big in this art, but so are fertility motifs, like the swarm of children clambering across their parents, or the paunchy belly and the wide childbearing hips. Now, these are set off by the slender neck and the slender limbs, the oversized head, traits that carry through the whole family portraiture. And this is not because anyone actually looked like this. This is because these images were meant to promote the ideology. They're campaign posters. The royal family's bodies are vehicles for promoting the party line. These portraiture traits are something that we see in the Berlin bust of Nefertiti also. We see the slender neck. It's almost snake-like the way it's so long and thin, but it's also exaggerated by this overly large head that's even further exaggerated by this very large crown that she has on. These are all meant to highlight the slender neck that would then go into a slender body if this piece had been made with a body. It never had a body. It was always made to stand just alone as a bust format. But these are traits that we see throughout all of the family members throughout the entire dynasty. This is not actually unique to this piece. So although this piece is unique for other reasons that are also important, the actual look of the statue and the so-called famous beauty of Nefertiti that we think of when we think of this piece is actually prevalent throughout the rest of the dynasty as well. So how did Nefertiti come to be such a superstar in the Berlin collection? Well, this started with the German excavations in Egypt. Now, this was back in the 19th century in the age of the so-called big digs. Now, these big digs, that is large-scale excavations, were carried on by several Western European countries at the time. And so what Germany was doing was not an exception, but it was part of a race to find cultural heritage. Germany mostly funded its excavation programs through the so-called Oriental Society, which was headed by James Simon, who's one of the great donors of Berlin museums, and in fact has the new visitor center named after him, the James Simon Gallery, which you might have seen in our other videos. Now, James Simon himself did not go to excavate, but he funded the entire excavation campaign in Egypt, in Akhenaten's capital city of Amarna, where Akhenaten and Nefertiti lived together. And because he funded it entirely alone, he also got sole property rights to everything that came out of the dig, or at least everything the Germans were allowed to keep from the dig. This was a time when everything that was dug out of the ground in archaeological excavation was split between the country where the digs were taking place and the people who were doing the digs, who often came from other countries. So on the German dig in Egypt, everything was split through a system called partage between the Germans and the Egyptians. This was the same for all of the items that came out of the dig that revealed the Nefertiti bust. Now, the ownership was going to become relevant, not in the first year of the Egyptian excavations by the Germans, headed by an archaeologist named Ludwig Burckhardt, but in the second year. It was in the second year that a spectacular set of buildings was found in Amarna, one of which was already identified as a sculptor's studio by the sculptor Thutmose. Luckily enough, Thutmose's name and job title were found nearby, carved onto an ivory clapper that was used for steering horses. I don't know if every artist studio had those at the time, but this artist had that, so his studio was already identified. Now, the excavators went in already expecting to find artistic material, and sure enough, Burckhardt and his workers, his Egyptian workers, were thrilled when they saw, buried in the sand, a neck. It was the neck of the bust of Nefertiti, painted. That was the first thing they saw. They already suspected it could be something great, so they uncovered it quickly and carefully. and discovered almost the entire bust together. Several of the fragments that were missing, they managed to recover from other parts of the same building complex, although some pieces were never found. That famous missing eye of Nefertiti, they looked for and never found, and only later realized it had never actually been inset into the sculpture. The sculpture was an unfinished piece, so that second eye that's still missing today had never even been finished, let alone put into the statue. Other pieces, like of the ears, which are still fragmentary today, were found and put back on the statue. Now, how Burckhardt and the German excavators came to be able to export the bust of Nefertiti to Berlin is a murky story. And this is a problem when we look from our current, modern, moral perspective back on the early 20th century. Things were done differently back then, but even so, we have records of what Burckhardt wrote in letters to friends that makes it seem that he was benefiting from a lack of information that he was giving to the Egyptian authorities. We should also say these authorities were not Egyptian themselves, they were French, who were governing the Antiquities Ministry at the time, and Egypt itself was under a sort of rule of the British at the time that would later become an official British protectorate. So the Egyptians themselves are actually not players in this story, not even minor players in this story. Now, Burckhardt wrote that he presented the authorities with a list of items he'd like to export, in which the bust of Nefertiti was listed along with several other plaster objects, and in the other list was a list of stone objects. Now, the Egyptian authorities and Burckhardt seemed to assume that the better objects would have been the stone objects and the plaster objects would have been of lesser value. And this is something that Burckhardt could profit from because the bust of Nefertiti is made of plaster over limestone. Burckhardt wrote in another letter to friends that he had benefited from the fact that the Egyptian inspectors had not looked into the box that housed the Nefertiti when they wanted to see what objects he wanted to export, and that he had benefited from that. Finally, he wrote to a German friend of his later that he had taken a photo of the bust and presented it to the authorities that did not show it in its best light. He even said it hid the beauty, but not to such an extent that later he could be accused of having hidden something. Now, these are pretty damning moral statements when we look back from our present position onto 1911, 1912, when these discoveries were being made. In 1920, James Seaman, who was the technical owner of the Nefertiti bust, decided to give this bust and the other Amarna finds to the Berlin museums. And these are the circumstances under which the Nefertiti bust came to the Berlin museums. Now, these historical circumstances have led to the two big current debates around the Nefertiti bust. One is about ownership. Who owns this bust? Right now, the Berlin museums claim ownership of it because of the German excavators who brought it to Berlin. And yet Egypt claims ownership because that was the country of origin. Now, the French and the British, who were administering Egypt and its antiquities at the time, do not have a claim to ownership and are also not saying that they do. But Egypt is saying that because those foreign countries were technically ruling their own, that this put them at a disadvantage for claiming their own cultural heritage. But although formal claims have been made from the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities to the Berlin museums, the Neues Museum is not budging, it's not giving this piece back. In fact, in 2012, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the bust having been discovered, the Neues Museum put on a huge display of many Egyptian artifacts from Amarna, including the bust of Nefertiti. Now, this is, of course, a celebration of research, but it is also a celebration of ownership because the Neues Museum does possess this object. Now, the other big debate surrounding this bust today has to do with new technologies, and especially 3D scanning and printing. Several years ago, two artists claimed that they had gone into the Neues Museum and made a surreptitious scan of the Nefertiti bust and put it into 3D modeling program to then publish an object file of the 3D model online. Now, after some research in recent years, especially by Cosmo Wenman, it seems that this is not the case, that the artist cannot possibly have surreptitiously scanned the object, but that the scan from the museum itself was somehow put into the public domain. Now, that chapter is another murky one in the history of the bust of Nefertiti. There's a lot to read online about this, and you can see some more on museums.love, where I've put together some links for you to read some of this incredible mystery story. But the last word is, what do we want our museums to do with objects like this? Do we want them to repatriate them to the countries they came from? Do we want them to enter into a debate about the value of these cultural heritage objects in foreign countries? And what do we want them to do with new technologies to make these objects more available, perhaps to people around the world who could never go to either country? Now, this official model from the Neues Museum has been made public, not by the museum itself, but by Cosmo Wenman. And it was that model that we used here at home to print a 3D model of our very own Nefertiti bust. These are just a few of the topics that we can talk about with the bust of Nefertiti. You can find out a lot more on museums.love. I'll see you there.